Hey everyone, welcome to another Turning the Tide video. I'm your host Cameron Larmer, and today I'm joined by Dr. Amanda Vincent, who's a seahorse expert, director and co-founder of Project Seahorse, professor at the Institute for Oceans and Fisheries, and she's also the chair at the IUCN's SSC Seahorse, Pipefish, and Sea Dragon Group. Hi Dr. Vincent, how are you?
Very well. Nice to talk to you, Cameron.
It's a pleasure to have you. So I'm just going to dive right in. You were the first person to study seahorses underwater. What drew you to work with seahorses in particular?
Yeah, well, the first biologist, who knows how many people had been watching seahorses, but the first biologist to study them underwater. Look, I was drawn by their male pregnancy. When you hear that only the male gets pregnant in a very elaborate form of parental care, then obviously there's a few questions that come up. And I wanted to know a lot about the evolution of their sex differences and how that compared to the norm. We generally think of males as being more colorful, more vocal, more aggressive, more conspicuous because they're competing for access to females. But I was curious as to whether it was a little bit different when you were going to end up pregnant. And the answer is no, males still competed more for reasons I won't go into now, but it led me to be fascinated with these creatures. And then, while a short time later I saw that there was a huge seahorse trade out of the Philippines, I began to get really intrigued.
How did Project Seahorse begin?
Well, a couple of friends and I were working on seahorse things together in the UK, in London, and people kept introducing us to each other, saying you really should know each other. And finally, we decided we needed a label for our work. So we formed a very casual alliance, which has since grown to be quite a force, actually, for marine conservation. We're a tiny group of people, but we punch way above our weight. And just by being strategic and thoughtful and leveraging our connections, we've managed to do really quite a lot for the ocean.
How has the project evolved from some of its early stages?
Well, so the best way I can explain that is by describing the world as a bit of an onion. So if you can imagine that we put seahorses at the center of a cross section of an onion, with the many rings. And at the beginning, we were studying seahorses, their biology, their ecology, their sex differences, and eventually their conservation. But of course, if you're going to do something good for seahorse conservation, you've also got to look after their communities and ecosystems. So there's the next layer of your onion world. And this is really the way Project Seahorse grew. And then if you're going to do that, then obviously you need to be aware of the people who are putting pressure on the ocean and helping them to find options for better choices. So there's the next layer of our onion and the next step of Project Seahorse work. And then in doing that, you realize after a while that they're constrained by economic opportunity, law and order, family situations. So then, of course, you have to get involved in that. And then you realize that what happens locally is hugely affected by what happens regionally and nationally. So we're working on the national scale, which is embedded in turn in the global scale. And so we've been going out through these layers of the onion world. And now we also work with citizen science because I guess the ultimate pressures are human behavior of greed and altruism, self-discipline, self-indulgence. So if you can have that scheme in your mind, you realize that you can't do much for seahorses if you don't actually manage to go through all those layers that are bearing down on the fish. And that's really the story of Project Seahorse. What started as studying the ecology of seahorses has taken us all the way out to changing United Nations policy.
Wow. When you talk about studying the ecology of seahorses, being one of the first biologists, if not the first biologist to study them underwater, what was that like given that you had no prior research to refer to?
Mostly really embarrassing at first. My first field work on seahorses was actually in Florida, in the Florida Keys, and I arrived all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed at the beginning of my PhD, determined to study seahorses. And I couldn't find the blessed things. I just didn't have a search image, and I couldn't locate them. And so for a while, I just worked with the pygmy seahorses, the little dwarf seahorses, pushing nets back and forth to try to find them. And then all of a sudden, I began to see them. And so I was able to do a bit of work on the mangrove roots and things like that. But it took a while before I really was able to connect with them when I was underwater and spot them. Now it's one of my few truly useful skills, finding seahorses, to the point where I see their tail. If I see a little twirl on a pattern of fabric, I think seahorse tail, but of course it's usually just a swirl on a pattern of fabric. So.
What have you learned in terms of their behavior?
I guess one of the fun breakthroughs early on was when I realized that they were monogamous. So that meant that one male, one female came together every morning and danced in a form of courtship, changing colors and pirouetting and promenading together. And the fact they maintained these pair bonds was super fascinating, but also really important. So as soon as the male gives birth, the female's there with more eggs. But if you disrupt those pairs, either by grabbing one out or by sending a trawl through the system, dragging the bottom, or in any other way disrupt their social system, you're also going to have really significant impacts on their reproductive rate, which of course has knock-on consequences for their population viability. So that was one of the early discoveries that, their social structure matters. And, you've got to take that into account when you're considering the impact of disruption.
Can you talk about some of what went into discovering that they had permanent pair bonds?
Lots of hours underwater, really fun. So I was working in Sydney Harbour in Australia, and we had each seahorse individually marked with a form of marking that we never use now. And every morning we would get in before dawn and just lay on the bottom watching individuals. And so we knew who they all were. Every animal was identified. And we would just sit and watch them and see, yep, here comes 16 again to visit 97. Yep, females were even numbers, male were odd numbers. And in would come 16 to visit 97. They'd do their little dance. They separate for the rest of the day. And then he was pregnant through all this. Then we came in and went, he's given birth. And sure enough, within minutes, 16 showed up with her load of eggs. And this time their morning dance went into a full courtship and mating. We got to the point where we could predict exactly which pair would mate when and where. So we could say this pair will mate between 10 and 11 o'clock this morning in that location. And that led to the first National Geographic article on seahorses with great photos prepared right for them. Lots of hours underwater with in very, very shallow water so that you could do really long dives, limited really only by your air tank.
You talk about that data with such precision, and you talk about how long it takes to come up with that data. What has been rewarding about your work and kept you motivated to do that research?
I just love seahorses. I think that's the starting point. They're just so weird and wonderful and magical, and loads of people don't even believe they exist. They sort of class them with the unicorn. So I'm really crazy about the animals. And one of the sadnesses now is I spend far too much time behind a desk or on a computer and don't get in the water very often. So there's that, and just really intrigued. I mean, these animals are quirky as heck, right? And to begin to understand them. And, the ocean is so unknown that almost everybody can instantly become an expert in some part of the ocean and of marine life because there's so few of us for such a vast amount of the world's biosphere. About 99% of the world's living space is in the ocean. 99% of the world's living space where life is possible is in the ocean. And there are really so few people who are actually immersed underwater that, anybody can quickly become really expert in their own little corner of the ocean and share the knowledge.
In defending your corner, you've had to go toe-to-toe with seahorse trade. When did you first learn about this environmental issue?
Yeah, I was traveling through Germany just as I finished my PhD, and there was this electronic billboard scrolling that said, in German, and I translate literally, seahorses are the most valuable exports from the Philippines, fisheries exports, to help men with weak tails was the literal translation, so as an aphrodisiac. And I was intrigued by this, so actually was writing an article for National Geographic at that point, and they agreed to fund me to follow this lead for a little while in the hope that I could get at least a couple of paragraphs of text, but of course it's been a lot more. So I ended up wandering through Southeast Asia, visiting a lot of very odd and unfamiliar places, taking some risks and identifying the scale and the impact and the importance of the seahorse trade.
And the seahorse trade spanned, I think it was over 80 countries. How did you start to address a problem that was global as well as local?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the biggest challenge in conservation is finding the leverage point, figuring out how you can affect the most change with the least effort, and because our resources and people are never sufficient. And so we started with a fishing village in the Philippines that was particularly dependent on seahorses, really to first work with that village, but also just to develop techniques and approaches. And I think the most important thing is to realize that you don't have to educate fishers about anything. Fishers see what's happening in front of them, and they knew the numbers were plummeting and they were worried about it. So there was a lot of receptiveness to trying to think of a new way forward as a partnership rather than as a top-down imposition of external views. And we always work with in-country nationals. So when I say we for the Philippines, that was Filipino biologists and Filipino social workers in collaboration so that we could deal with the science and the human aspects interchangeably. And actually, I don't know that I went toe-to-toe with the seahorse trade. I think it's more a case of identifying that there were real problems and starting dialogues. So we've worked really, really well with the seahorses are used for traditional medicine, aquarium, pets, ornamental display, and curiosities and souvenirs. And we found the traditional medicine dealers are really open to discussions and partnership because they actually want to maintain their supplies and they're very worried about over-exploiting. So I think we've been able to find common ground with just about everybody. And maybe that's one secret of why things have often been advancing, is because we first look for common ground rather than yelling or shouting.
And one of the tools that you found common ground with is marine protected areas. Can you talk about what those are and why they've been so significant in the Philippines and Canada?
Yeah, we're working on some in China now. Well, our ocean has been treated like sort of open game. You can take whatever you want, however you want, whenever you want, with very little regulation. The US has done a better job of that recently, but many countries of the world, there's just been anarchy when it comes to ocean extraction. And so protected areas are really, really important. There's a global agreement now that at least 10% of all ocean must be protected by this year, and we're getting close to that. And then the next push is going to be 30% protected by 2030. And that's becoming global policy, I think, as we speak. The protected areas give fish and other marine life a place to grow up and reproduce. Bigger fish produce more young, so if you let them grow without fishing them, that increases their reproductive output. And obviously, baby fish need a place to grow up where they're not being extracted willy-nilly, so that's important. They also allow habitat to recover because you're not putting damaging fishing gear through, or you're not anchoring, or depending on the level of protection, you're really looking after that habitat as well. And then the idea is that the fish that do well in that protected area will eventually export their young or eventually migrate out of the area to help support fisheries as well. So there's very, very good evidence that protected areas make a massive difference in conservation and can be very helpful for fisheries under certain circumstances. And we've really found that there's a lot of appetite for protected area. They intuitively make sense to people. So we worked with a lot of different people really to set aside parts of the ocean where there's no fishing, and that's led to measurably more fish in some of those areas, well, many of those areas, which is deeply reassuring. The ocean is under enormous pressure, but it's quite resilient. So if you can take the pressure off, you can commonly get quite a good response from the ocean. It makes sense. If you stop fishing, then obviously there's going to be a better chance of recovery. So we're not against fishing, but fishing has to be brought under regulation and under control. Bottom trawling is when you drop your net and you scrape the bottom, you drag the bottom, and you grab everything in the path of the net. And it can be, what you wanted to catch, but largely it's what you didn't go out to catch, but you now retain. So it's a very destructive form of fishing, and it's always yielded quite a lot of what we call bycatch, stuff you didn't mean to get. And gradually a market has emerged for that bycatch. And so bycatch is now kept and sold. And most trawls in the world are catching 95% bycatch, things you didn't mean to get. But now in many areas of the world where we work, like in India and China, Thailand and so on, the trawl pressure has been so heavy that when they go out to fish, everything they catch is unplanned. They just go out to drop the nets and grab life in its form. And then they come back and try to find a market for this hodgepodge assembly of stuff. And it's very difficult. So often in such circumstances, the catch of amazing marine fishes and invertebrates is sold for use in fish meal or fish oil. It's sold often for use as to feed chickens or to feed aquaculture fish. And there's no limit to this fishing because they're not targeting anything specifically. They're just going out to catch life for carbon to feed other animals. And they usually get almost no money for what they've caught. And it's very, very poor yield. And they only survive on subsidies, which means government money to reduce the price of fuel, for example, for the boats, or they have slavery to reduce the cost of labor on the boats. So not only is it an ecologically devastating way to fish, but it's also a real violation of human rights very often, and a tremendous waste of our public resources and government money around the world. So it's certainly the single biggest pressure for seahorses, but it's probably the single biggest scourge in most inshore waters of the ocean.
You propelled global legislative action through CITES. After getting something like that passed, how much effort goes into actually implementing the policies?
Well, huge. I mean, you're absolutely right, because you don't just want paper agreements. You need effective, serious initiatives that are actually implemented. So we work a lot with a whole host of countries to try to make certain that they can regulate. Quite a number of countries found it so difficult to regulate, or were not prepared to put the effort in, that they actually ceased exports. And now, in theory, 96% of the former trade would be illegal because of national bans following on the CITES restrictions. Trade still continues at quite a significant level, which is why I find bans a bit pointless often. Like, let's get serious about regulation and sustainability. So we're now giving direct advice to countries that are trying to make certain that their exports are at appropriate levels. It's a lot of work, and we're a tiny group of people. Like, at any one time, there's only about 6 of us full time. So one of the great joys now is working with the global expert group on seahorses, pipefishes, and sea dragons. And that is largely comprised of younger people and developing country nationals who are super keen and enthusiastic and really have huge energy and insight and just need a bit of mentorship or a bit of support or a bit of us connecting them to people who can help. So that fills me with enthusiasm as more and more people start to engage. But still, there are 47 species found all over the world in all the shallow, temperate, and tropical seas. And our group globally is only 32 people. So you can see that, there's still a need for lots more engagement.
What are some of the next steps you want to take in terms of your research and conservation?
I want to end bottom trawling. I am tired of watching this pillage of the ocean. It makes no sense at all. Imagine looking at your favorite forest, your favorite hillside, and seeing helicopters drop razor wires that chop down every single thing in their path, including plowing into the earth. I mean, it's completely mad. And they remove every bee, butterfly, bird, and bear, and they mulch it all down, and then they feed it to fish. You'd probably think this was an insanity, and yet that's exactly how bottom trawling operates. So bottom trawling has to end, and I'm going to do everything I can to help with that. And then beyond that, we really want to try to get the global illegal trade in seahorses under control and, generate a whole bunch more protected areas. And really make certain that more and more people are engaged in this battle, because there's a really big crying need for professionals, but collaborators and members of the community and citizen groups and people in all walks of life to start caring about the ocean. The single biggest problem in ocean conservation is that most people don't understand the ocean and don't feel an affinity with it. Florida, it's going to be a bit better, but even in Florida, I would guess that the average person, if you ask them to close their eyes and think about the ocean, would imagine waves lapping on a beach. And what we really need is to get people to have an insight that the ocean is valleys and mountains and forests and jungles and plains and deserts, all filled with the most extraordinary forms of life that we need to value and cherish. And sure, we can eat some of them, but let's not go nuts here.
We need them to think about more of the outer layers of the onion rather than just a couple at the center.
Well, I think that everybody can make their contribution their own way. If we have people who work in the entertainment industry, let's try to tell the stories in an engaging way that gets people to care. If we have people who work in computer programming and software design, we all need help with, managing huge amounts of data. If there's people who work in advertising and marketing, boy, do we need your help to get the stories out there. If people who work in law, I mean, there's room for absolutely everybody. People who have mechanical skills, people who just taxi drivers, I find, are some of the best ambassadors of the ocean when they're passionate about them. I've had them tell me amazing stories. And if they could talk to every passenger, wouldn't that make a difference? So there's room for absolutely everybody. Hairdressers spend a lot of time hovering over women's heads. And if they wanted to tell more stories about the ocean, boy, would that be influential. So I know that right now Florida isn't visiting a lot of hair salons, but that'll be coming back eventually. In the COVID context, we're going to have to rethink the economy as we reopen it in a variety of different ways. And there's a big push now to try to really look for more green and, dare I say, blue ways to think about the way we interact with nature and try to adjust that a bit.
What have been some of the success stories that give you hope that you're going in the right direction?
Yeah, I'm definitely an ocean optimist. It's pretty exciting that we've got close to 10% of the world being set aside as marine protected areas, more or less approaching 10% in many countries in the world. So we got to get to 30% by 2030, but we'll go there. I think it's hugely interesting that people have got so passionate about plastics in the ocean. To be clear, plastics are interesting and important, but they're not the biggest issue in the ocean. The biggest issue by far, the biggest threat to most marine life is unregulated, poorly managed fisheries. And that's where we should be putting our attention. Plastics are fine, but the government finds it much easier to deal with plastics than to deal with fisheries. So therefore, that's why we see response from governments on plastics and no uptake on fisheries regulation, really. I should say that the U.S. has led the world, really, in moving towards very good fisheries management. Some of that's under threat in the current administration, but, we just need to guard every gain jealously to make certain that fisheries are viable without threatening ocean conservation. I think there's a lot of good stuff. Chatting to somebody who at 14 founded an NGO called Turning the Tide, that gives me hope. It's pretty important that young people see a sense of ownership with the ocean and then communicate that to their buddies. And, any way we more established folk can help with that is important.
If there's one thing you can leave people with in terms of conservation, what would it be?
Use your vote for the ocean. When you get a chance to vote next, make certain you ask every single candidate for elected office, every single one, what their attitude is to ocean conservation, what they would do to look after our heritage, our treasure that is the ocean. In Canada, 40% of our surface area is ocean. It's got to be similar in the US. So we need to make that front and center in a lot of decision making. And use your vote. Just ask. And if they don't have answers, ask again until they do. And that alone would make a really big difference.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been lovely chatting with you. All good luck with Turning the Tide.